Hey, buddy, watch this.
Oh yeah, let's talk about some dragons. And no, don't ask me how that card in the intro works. I have no idea. It's just for fun. But we do have some pretty cool designs in this video from you guys, the RegisKillbin community, and they're all legendary dragons. And this is going to be a two-parter. There were so many cool dragon designs. So here are the first 10 incredible cards. Up first is Nefarian, the Undying from Synth and Lasers, a 10 mana 8/12 dragon for Warlock. Death Rattle, go dormant, and then awaken this minion after 5 other minions have been destroyed. So you've got yourself here a fairly slow minion, an 8/12 that doesn't really do anything immediately that you play on board, but if it dies off, it goes dormant, it's going to be this recurring source of a gigantic threat. And 5 minions dying really isn't all that many, right? Even in a late game, like control versus control battle, there are still a minion or 2 dying every turn. So maybe every 2-3 turns, Nefarian comes back. And then in a lot of matchups with more token styles, particularly with Warlock, a class that can remove wide boards with ease, you're going to be killing off 4 or 5 minions every turn. So you might be getting a Nefarian every single turn, coming back, till eventually your opponent just can't deal with this sort of card. So I love the idea here that Nefarian is kind of like absorbing all these dead minions to empower his return. That's really cool as a zombified Nefarian. And I think from a mechanic standpoint, this would be a pretty fun card to play too. Combines a little bit of like a Dread Steed with a Corridor Creeper into something big and awesome and threatening, but still fairly slow, so that I think it stays somewhat balanced. Perhaps even too slow here to be particularly strong card, but a fun build around idea. Really cool capturing of the character. So all in all, this one's neat. So now moving on to Karach the Cannibal from Obosh. This is a 10 mana 8/8 neutral legendary dragon with a battle cry: eat 3 dragons in your deck and deal each one's attack as damage to random enemy minions. So a cannibal dragon is a really cool idea. Eating your own cards is cool, something we've seen before with Grawl. And in this case, instead of turning those into like stats with Grawl, you are instead turning them into a big board swing potential. Because you have like a couple 8-attack dragons in your deck, your opponent has some big threats out there, you're going to be able to kill a couple mountain giants, for instance, with one play off Karach the Cannibal. So in some ways, kind of like a Deathwing style card that trades resources for board presence and a swing card, but unlike Deathwing, you get to retain your hand, you're pulling from your deck instead. Now, it's not as universal of a swing, doesn't have as big of a stat line, so there are some counterbalancing elements, but still pretty interesting idea. Now, if you don't have any dragons in your deck, this is just a 10 mana 8/8. If you only have 1 dragon in your deck, it gets significantly weaker, but could still maybe swing for 1 minion on board. Alternatively, if you have weak dragons in your deck, this isn't nearly as good. So you don't like eating your big dragons, maybe because you want big dragons, but you don't want to put small dragons in there because then you don't do enough damage. So there's this really cool deck building creativity that's required to support a card like Karach, finding some correct mix of dragons, maybe some smaller, some larger, hoping they hit correctly. All of that makes this card really, really fun to play. And I think the idea of it's nailed as well. So very, very cool design. So now let's talk about Traxion, the successor from Meineke, a priest dragon, 10 mana 4/12, and it reads, whenever a card is played, shuffle a copy of it into your deck, and that copy costs only 1 mana. So a resource generating card extraordinaire here. We've got this 1 mana cost element that Priest has been doing a little bit of, right? Things like Spirit of the Dead do the same kind of effect, but instead bundled into a giant dragon. And again, here we have a card that's seemingly quite slow the turn you play it. It's going to be hard to play any cards immediately with this one, but keep in mind this is not just friendly cards that are played, it's all cards. So if your opponent, say, uses a removal card for something like this, well, boom, you're going to get that removal card shuffled into your deck for only 1 mana. You might get like a Siphon Soul. That's kind of cool. If they're forced to use multiple removal cards to answer something like this, or, you know, maybe a combo, they have to play a Vile Spine Slayer in Wild, then you might get 2 cards off your old Traxion. If they don't have an answer, you might get 3 or 4 awesome cards. But there's also a cool thing your opponent can do where they could shuffle bad stuff into your deck. If they have really weak minions late in the game, you're not going to want to draw those. So there are some some risks with old Traxion as well. And I love cards like that where there's this big payoff, there are some potential downsides, creates a lot of friction on the board, a lot of decisions to be made for both players. Those are fun cards in Hearthstone, and old Traxion seems like a really fun card to me. Moving on here to Aragos from DiscoKid. This one puts a dragon in Rogue, which I think is a pretty tough thing to do. A bit of a challenge, perhaps, to make a dragon that fits in Rogue. But this takes, presumably, a blue Dragonflight dragon in the world of, say, Malagos, and makes it fit Rogue rather nicely, because Aragos reads, whenever you cast a 1-cost spell, gain spell damage +1. So by default, Aragos, pretty weak minion, but if you can chain a couple 1-mana spells together, your Aragos is going to start gaining a lot of permanent spell damage. So, you know, even just like a couple Sinister Strikes, for instance, might fuel this up rather nicely. But you'll note, if you look at the Rogue pool, there's a lot of like 2-mana spells, and a lot of 0-mana spells. There's not as many great 1-mana spells. There are certainly a handful, some deadly poisons, those sorts of things are out there, but they maybe don't work super well with spell damage. So it's like Sinister Strike, and then what else are you going to use? Well, in wild format, you know, you've got things like Razor Petals. That could be awesome, but that's sort of the challenge, is like maybe use spells that aren't good with spell damage to empower some other spells with spell damage. Maybe you just build this up, then you slam with an Eviscerate at the end. I don't know how this works exactly, but it's super cool. I guess Spare Parts would be awesome in Wild too. So maybe there's a Wild format card more than a standard one in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, it's a design that kind of twists your brain a little bit for how you play Rogue and how you build a deck and how you try to support it. But it can do some cool things when you start to make all that line up and make it work. And making a dragon work for Rogue is a pretty difficult task. I think DiscoKid achieved rather nicely here. So we've got here a pretty intriguing resource/thief style card, which is a great fit for Priest, by the way. This is like a thought steal sort of thing, taking your opponent's card, putting them into your hand, but it's a specific set of cards, which makes this really intriguing, because if your opponent, say, plays like a hero card, and you want to get a hero card, boom, Murozond can do that. Or if they play like 5 things in one glorious turn, and you need a ton of resources, okay, you can do that with Murozond, but you've got this thing waiting in hand that you just have to pick the perfect strategic moment to play. And I love that idea. Like, when is the right time to use my Murozond? Sure, some games it would be obvious, but in others it would be really difficult. But I like that you have to make that calculation. I think it's also important here that you can't really do much the turn you play Murozond, since he is 9 mana. If this was like a 4-mana card, it would probably be crazy OP, right? Even if it was a few less cards or something. Because you'd have the option to utilize those cards immediately. But since there's a bit of a delay baked in here, since the minion itself doesn't really interact with the board immediately, I think that counterbalances Murozond in a really beautiful way, so that you can generate some resources, you can do some cool stuff. Your opponent is going to be mindful of a card like this, right? So maybe they hold their hero card if they think they don't need it. If giving it to you is bigger downside than them utilizing it, maybe they never empower the Murozond, or try to line up, you know, like one bad card or one weak card and one good card in a turn every time to kind of limit their exposure to a card like this. All of that sounds magnificently fun as far as gameplay is concerned. Who knows if the numbers are right here, but I think this card would be a blast in Hearthstone. Great known character in Warcraft as well. The time travel stuff's kind of fitting here too. So all in all, Murozond seems perfect. So now let's take a look at Nithog from Dalaferferg, a 4-mana 3/5 dragon for Shaman. And he's all about lightning in this character, so pretty good fit there. Battlecry: for each of your overloaded mana crystals, add a lightning bolt to your hand. So I'm going to be honest with you here. I think this card is a little bit OP right now as it stands. I would tweak some numbers on this. I would make this like a 6-mana 4/5 or 5/5 or something. Mainly, I would want to increase the mana cost a little bit, just to limit the number of lightning bolts you could play immediately. Because as it stands right now, right, you could theoretically overload 6 mana crystals in a turn, which really isn't that hard to do, by the way. There are a couple different ways that you could do that rather easily, but even like 4, 5, 6 is a lot of mana crystals overloaded. Then you play Nithog, and you've got 6 lightning bolts added to your hand, which that's already 18 damage. If you roll a spell damage totem, any kind of spell damage minion, then boom, you're looking at like 24 damage off of a single card. Generating that many resources is probably too many, right? And I recognize that. I know that this is a little bit OP as it stands, so I would adjust the numbers personally. But that's okay. I still like this design so much, this idea of converting your overloaded mana crystals into something powerful for you, That's a really good execution, and this is like the perfect character to do it. You've got a storm lightning oriented dragon here. So this feels fantastic as far as I'm concerned from a flavor, from a creativity standpoint. Just fix those numbers a little bit in my mind. I think you could hit a sweet spot for this card where it's still very good, but not like crazy potential. Because right now I think the potential is a little bit high, despite the fact that it is kind of slow to do all that right. You're taking kind of 3 turns to set up an OTK, but it only demands 1 or a couple cards of overload, right? So still pretty easy to achieve despite any speed issues there. So all in all, an interesting card, a really creative card. Recognize that it's OP in a lot of ways, at least I think so. If you disagree, please feel free to share those thoughts, as always. But I just like so much about it that I'm willing to overlook some of those balance concerns. Next up here, we have another Shaman Dragon. This one's Quetzal. Nailed it. Perfect execution on the pronunciation. It comes from Mech and Neck. It's an 8-mana 2/12, and the battle cry reads, repeat all overload spells that you played this game. And kind of similar in a lot of ways to our previous card, turning overload into something cool, but in a different direction. Our previous card was all about like one big combo thing with overload. This is more about like a long-term game plan payoff for your overload, which is something I think we really need. Like Vicina has kind of teased that, but that was in more of a token-oriented way. And like Thunderhead, same sort of thing. Overload support, but in a token style. What if we shifted that overload support into a late-game Zul'jin bomb kind of thing? So you're slamming lightning storms, right? You're using it as a big swing opportunity, a big way to stabilize a board. You get some Feral Spirit Wolves, you clear the board with Lightning Storm, boom, you've made an incredible turn. But note that your next turn will suck because you will be overloaded a ton. That's how these sorts of things work. Overload off these always seem to punish you. So I like this. Like, give overload a different way to play. Make it the actual true centerpiece for the class instead of like a secondary effect that it's seemingly always been. And I think this card would really help deliver that. So now moving on to Nemesis the Decayed from Sengap Kote. This is an 8-mana 8/5 neutral dragon battlecry. Give your minions a random death rattle. I added a word there. There's obviously a typo, but that's okay. I think this is a really cool idea for a card. We've obviously got this skeletal, deathly dragon, and he's so powerful that he's giving other minions some random death rattle from cards in Hearthstone. And some of those might be totally nonsensical and useless. Some of those might be rather amazing. And maybe the Hearthstone devs could curate the pool here to make sure they make at least some kind of sense, because maybe not all death rattles would, right? Based on conditions and all sorts of things. But it's a neat idea because there's a lot of variance in death rattles, right? It's the difference between like summoning a 7/7 and drawing a card. Like both of those are good. One's way better than others. And of course, there are some bad death rattles in Hearthstone too. So it's going to be a toss-up about what you get, but that's what makes a card like this really cool. It could be a great board stabilizing follow-up. It makes your board more immune and defensive. You play a nice threat yourself here as an 8-attack minion. I just like that this is a sort of follow-up card that's in a different direction. Most follow-up cards in Hearthstone are like Bloodlust to deal damage, those sorts of things, finishing pieces. This takes it in a new way, and in some ways it's kind of like Soul of the Forest, right? Like that always summons you 2/2s, but it's a mixed bag. It's a toss-up, so it's way more fun, way more enjoyable. This card could probably be a little bit cheaper and still be pretty cool, but nonetheless, I like this idea and certainly fits the name and artwork that's been offered here. So now let's take a look at Nether Spite from Kizaru GR, an 8-mana 7/7 neutral dragon with a battlecry that opens a random portal. And there are 4 portals here. Presumably, these would work like the old Warlock quest that summoned a portal that would summon 3/2 imps onto the board, right? We've got a Murloc, Demon, Elemental, and Dragon portal. They all summon a random minion of their type, but they last for different durations based on presumably the power level of the average minions inside. For instance, dragons are going to be bigger on average, so this portal only lasts for 6 turns, whereas Murlocs are much weaker, so the portal basically lasts like forever, more or less, for most Hearthstone games anyway. And that's a cool idea to like balance these out a little bit, but to be frank, I would cut the numbers of all of these in half. I would make the dragon last for 3 turns, elementals for 5, demons for 6, and murlocs for 15. I think it would still be a pretty intriguing card because the Warlock quest payoff was pretty cool, getting an infinite supply of imps. It was still weak in the scheme of things, but could turn certain kinds of games around. There's no doubt about that. But those were just 3/2 imps, right? Like, a random dragon could be like an 8/8 or a 12/12, and that could be far too punishing. There are also some 3/2s in there, of course, but that swing variance, that big of a high roll isn't a good kind of thing. So limiting that as much as possible would be cool. I might even say like, you know, summoning random dragon for 5 or less mana or something of the sort to kind of limit the swing potential on this sort of card. But despite any kind of balance concerns, I think this is just a really cool idea. A lot of people went with another spite giving you portal cards that are named portals like Firelands Portal, Maelstrom Portal. I like that this went in a different direction, found fantastic artwork for all of these. Like the art on these is fantastic. The card is constructed in an incredibly clean and tidy way. So much about this from a flavor standpoint, from a design standpoint, from a feel standpoint, knocks it out of the park that once again, even though I don't agree with all the numbers here and the power level here, I do think this card is just really, really well made. So finally here we've got Smaug the Terrible from Goblin Elf. Of course, a Lord of the Rings character, but less could fit into Hearthstone rather nicely. He's a 7-mana 7/4 dragon, and his battle cry deals 4 damage to all enemy minions, so basically a flame strike, which of course you can imagine Smaug doing that. He shoots flame all the time in The Hobbit, and maybe you saw the Hobbit movie with him. He's shooting flame everywhere, right? So certainly a great fit that he cleans out the board. Also here we've got a stat line that's very reminiscent of Crowd Roaster, but instead of attacking only one minion, he's wiping out the entire board. That's a cool kind of callback to a previous card. But because his power level is so high, of course, he does have a downside here that you give your opponent 3 coins. So Smaug, known for, you know, being on his hoard of gold there, you can kind of see it in the artwork here. And if you can get past him, if you can kill him, I guess you're going to get a reward, 3 coins. So functionally, from like a raw tempo mana standpoint, Smaug is kind of like a 10 mana minion in some ways, which feels about right? You get like a 7 mana flame strike, you get a body to boot. That feels pretty good. But of course, coins can have additional upsides for your opponent. Just giving them a lot of flexibility with their mana, doing more in a single turn, combinations with spell style effects. So there could be bigger downsides than just mana is concerned. So a great story being told with this card. I really like that. It feels true to the character. It feels like that classic dragon story, defeat the dragon, get the gold sort of thing. That feels fantastic. And from a Hearthstone design, it fits in really nicely too. So all in all, great execution of Smaug and just a cool Hearthstone card. So there you go. Those are the first 10 legendary dragons. I got 10 more amazing cards, and I didn't just like put all the awesome ones in this one. The next video is going to be pretty amazing too. A lot of great cards left to discuss, so stay tuned for that very soon. But I'm sure you're also curious about the next submission for custom cards. There are going to be links in the description below. The theme next time is going to be a legendary weapon. Design a legendary weapon for Hearthstone. It can be based on a Warcraft weapon from like World of Warcraft, for instance, whether legendary or not. Should have some kind of name, right? If it's going to be legendary, it should be named. If you are going to use an outside weapon like Excalibur or something, it just needs to be a medieval style. Don't give me like sci-fi weapons. We've done that already. Needs to be Hearthstone-esque, fit within the lore and the fantasy of Hearthstone, so just be a little bit careful there. But again, submission details below. Until then, feel free to leave some great comments and feedback on these cards in the comments below. And until next time, game on.